Hey friends, how are we doing? Heath Home here. Welcome to another Sunday Fun Day live stream. Today I'm going to be showing you a fun and creative workflow that's perfect for coming up with like variations of your individual tracks and bringing a DJ performance kind of feel to your Ableton Live session view workflow and a whole lot more. I'll explain what I'm doing along the way, so whether you're completely new to music production and Ableton Live or you're a seasoned pro, I'm sure there will be some key takeaways for everyone in today's live stream. And in the end, the goal is to inspire you to boot up Ableton and go and make some music. Feel free to drop any questions you have in the chat and I'll do my best to answer them. And so without further ado, let's dive in. So today, hopefully, there's a few more working parts in today's live stream. So you might see that we have an extra camera involved. So I'm actually shooting what I'm going to be doing with a MIDI controller. So hopefully, as I said, fingers crossed, all the new mechanical parts and everything works, and you'll be able to see what I'm doing on the MIDI controller as well as I'm over there in the corner. Today I've remembered to keep the info tab open, so hopefully you'll be able to see everything. Of course, if you're here in the live stream, let me know in the chat if my microphone levels are fine, if you can hear the music okay, and of course if you can see what I can see in terms of the cameras, etc. So what have I got in front of me today? I have got a Novation Launch Control XL. No, I don't get a commission from Novation for using this device. I'm not trying to push that you should go out and buy yourself one of these, but it is a very handy little MIDI controller, and it's nice, I believe, to have in a music production studio setup a few different options when it comes to mapping MIDI and MIDI controllers. In this case, we've got some really nice faders that we can interact with, obviously knobs as well that we can map to different things, as well as buttons that we can push. So actually this controller's a great little controller for live performance, and hopefully you can see today how it can be great also for your composition phase when you're starting out your tracks or even trying to evolve them. And so what have I got here? Well, I've got the music idea from last week. So let's maybe just have a quick listen to that. So just this simple idea that I kind of constructed and built in the previous week's live stream. I'll put a link to that up here if you haven't seen that. I suggest you can go back and watch that, and it will give you an idea of how I got to here. And I've simplified it here just to 8 tracks, which matches my controller nicely as I have 8 channels here. So at the very top corner of the controller up here, where I'll put my finger, there is 2 types of modes you can put the Novation Launch Control XL, this is the Mark II by the way as well, in factory or user. So there's 2 little buttons at the top here. I'm actually going to stick in the factory mode, which when you have a software like Ableton Live and you use this controller and you put it in factory mode, essentially there's a lot of things that automatically happen, which are that the volume faders are already mapped to the faders on the tracks here. The top macros, if you like, are mapped to the 2 sends. So you can see hopefully that I'm moving A and B there, the 2 sends. The volume are on the faders. And then at the bottom here, I've got track focus, which is a bunch of buttons along here. And you can probably see I'm moving my way along the different tracks here. Okay, so I can bring a track into focus. And then at the very bottom, I have a choice of what the second button below it does, and in this case I'm using mutes. So you can see I'm taking the tracks in and out. So with MIDI we won't go into too much complication with it, but there are various MIDI messages that we can send and map, and if you've got a MIDI controller around, if you're lucky to have a push or a keyboard, amazing. If you've got something that has faders and knobs that you can map CC messages, that's going to be really useful today, because all of these things, apart from like if you're talking about a button like that mute that I was just showing you there, that's literally a MIDI message where we're just doing on off, right? So I'm just taking track 1 out, putting it back in. A CC message is when we have something like this fader moving, you know, right through a bunch of different volume values, or a knob that's moving around. So I've done, as I said, by working in factory mode, I'm keeping this quite simple, because I'm sort of saying, okay, well, Ableton already, those things are mapped. But there is a second function, even in the factory mode, with these bottom row of macros down here, which are currently default mapped to the panning. So if you're looking at channel 1 here, you'll notice that I'm moving the panning left to right. So in its default, all of those bottom row of macros are controlling the pans of the 8 tracks, but I can actually go over to the right hand side here and I can click device. So let's maybe bring track 4 into focus. So you can see down here, this is the acid synth. And if I hold down, if I click the device key, if we look sort of carefully in down here on the bottom of the track, we'll notice just there's a blue hand sort of somewhere, and that's sort of basically telling me that at the moment the launch control bottom row of macros would now be controlling whatever that device is that's attached to the blue hand. And I can move that blue hand, which is what I want to do actually. So I'm going to hold the device button down, and then I can move to the left here and move my blue hand over till it arrives at the actual instrument itself. And you can see here now I've got this blue hand here, right? And now if I grab the very first macro over here on the left, you can see I'm now moving the very first macro in that instrument over there, right? So that's corresponding. So the good thing about launch control from Novation, in the factory mode, we can switch between panning and devices, but we're still, that movement there, I've got 8 macros along the bottom here. Ableton's going to decide what those 8 macros will move, right? And in general, it's going to be the top 6 here plus 2 at the bottom. So if I go to the very furthest right one, we should see I'll move this one down here, which is correct. Okay, so what I want to do is take a bit of control of that and show you a little bit of mapping and how this whole setup can, you know, get really creative results, and it can be really good for coming up with, like, you know, new parts for this track, taking it, perhaps you come up with something completely new that you prefer to what you already have, and you're much more tactile and physical here because we're working in a way with software but more with a hardware feel. And I'd really encourage that. As I said, it's not a huge investment to have something like this, and if you're working in the box in the computer and always relying on the mouse and things like that, this gets a lot more musical and a lot more performing, and you get different results from that. And that's kind of how this came about, this video, because I was, and I still plan to do it, was going to take this loop and arrange it into a song, and I was going to do it more as a performance arrangement instead of copying and pasting, which is still my plan to do that with this track idea. But I want to show you first what's going to happen and what's quite exciting when I start to work with the MIDI controller a little bit and use it with what we've got here. So right now, as I said, we've got this little preview here, and we can take things out by muting the channels. So we could already kind of get a feel for how we might sort of start the track, perhaps.
A couple of things. Taking a break from my wife, forgetting my son's birthday, and a couple of things. Taking a break from my wife, forgetting my son's birthday, and a couple of things. My wife, forgetting my son's birthday.
That's pretty straightforward and pretty basic, and of course, as I said, I can bring all the volumes down and then bring them all up, but we're going to look to sort of get stuck into why I wanted to sort of show you this and what are some of the advantages here. And I'm going to show you a bit of custom mapping. So if we want to do some MIDI mapping, if we've got a MIDI controller, we can come up here to the top right and hit the little MIDI box over here at the very top up in this right corner, or we can do Command M if we wish, or Control M on a Mac. and everything's going to turn blue. And when it's blue, we can now go and start doing MIDI mapping, and I'll open up the browser side of things for a second as well over here, and you'll see that actually I've already gone ahead and done one pre-mapping, and it's something that if I'm using this particular controller, it's something I always do, and that is that all of the volume faders I've assigned and made the maximum dB is the thing I've changed here to 0 dB. So if I push all the faders up, they won't go over 6 dB by default on these faders on the Novation. They will go to plus 6 dB. So that's something I always do, and I didn't want to bore you with watching me just do that. It's just simply chose all the different faders, and you can see here each fader has the CC value that's assigned, and then I've chosen to just set the maximum of all of them to 0 dB. So as I said, we can push the fader up and we know we're not going to clip and go over 6 over 0 dB, which could go all the way to 6. So that's just to show you that I pre-did that. But what I want to show you next, and this you don't actually need a MIDI controller for, but you'll see the advantage hopefully in a moment with a MIDI controller, but I want you to see something that maybe a lot of people are sleeping on, I think, and not taking advantage of. So let's start with the fun stuff now. The silver box, the acid synth down here. I'm going to click on that. And what I want to do essentially is right now, let's just say we kind of basically mute everything. We'll just have the silver box playing at the moment. So if we hit play. So that's how I left it last week. That was the sound of this particular patch, the sequence that I came up with, and the instrument. What I want to do is get this instrument to a point where I could really mess around with all of these macros that I've created in the instrument. And by the way, little plug there, if you want acids sounding preset, this is one I built myself to kind of give me exactly that TB303 sound in my own projects, because I couldn't find a preset from Ableton that delivered that for me personally. And it is available for cost of a couple of coffees in my Gumroad store. So I'll put a link below if you fancy grabbing a copy of it. Support the channel, amazing stuff. Anyway, moving on. I'm going to click on the silver box. What I want to do is kind of preserve all these macros, right? Because if I start mapping them or moving them like Ableton already lets me move the first, as I said, 8 of those aligned with this, but it's deciding which ones move. It's also going to mess up how this sounds, right? And how do I know how to get it back to how it sounded before? So first things first, I'm going to group that into an instrument rack. And then I'm going to open up the macro tabs of the instrument rack here. And what I'm going to do, and this is the real great thing about this, which I think is probably the big focus of today, is snapshots. And if we look down the left-hand side of the instrument rack here, we've got this little camera icon that's currently hidden. And if we click that, we open up this little box here. And so what I can do straight away now is click New at the top here, right? Well, sorry. First of all, I need to kind of map the macros to this panel here. So I jumped the gun a little bit there. So let's do that first. So let's say we put all of these over and start mapping them. And again, I can decide what is mapped to what over here. So I'm going to say, let's have the tuning. So I'm going to right click on that, map it to macro 1, the cutoff frequency to macro 2. I'm going to follow the kind of order here a bit. But if I don't wish to have the envelope modulation, I can remove that, right? It doesn't have to be done that way. And we can also add macros here if we wish to build that out. That's with the plus and minus. But in this case, keeping in mind that actually Ableton's only going to give me 8 to play around with. So something to think about, right? So probably what you want to do is make your most important 8 showing up in the device itself. So let's say we're picking the most important 8. I'm going to leave the oscillator out. I definitely want decay, so I'm going to put that down to macro 5. I definitely want accent, so that's going to be on macro 6. Macro 7 and 8, so a bit of a decision there. I'm going to leave the oscillator. That just switches this device from saw to sine, square to saw. Global tuning could be interesting. Definitely the overdrive could also be interesting, but I'm going to go for Well, let's say overdrive, spoiled for choice here. And then let's say we have the, maybe we'll do global mod as well. So I'll just undo that last one and I'll put these in order. So we'll have on 7 global mod and the overdrive on 8. So as you can see, I've picked and chosen the ones I want. Now, if I wasn't restricted to these 8 macros on this MIDI controller, so if you've got a bigger one and you've got more, I would map all of those, right? And then I could move all the macros for all of them. But in this case, I've sort of cherry picked the 8 ones that I want. If I go over here now and click new, right, now I get safeguarded the settings of all of this device, except for the ones that I didn't map, right? And we can call this, we can rename this snapshot. Let's call it original. So we know that's the original. And we can also kind of right click down in here and you can see that if you wish, you can, in this menu, pull up exclude macro from randomization. So if we're going to randomize in a moment and you don't want these ones that, or any one in particular, that you don't want it to be randomized, then we can exclude it from that. What am I talking about with randomization? Well, now we can kind of mess around with this. So let's have a look at the acid synth for a second. So first of all, I can use my MIDI controller to kind of perform a bit. So I could go in here straight away and so maybe I'll just bring in a bit more music so we have a bit of context. Then I'll bring the track still keeping 4 in focus and I'll just mess around with this a bit. So as you can hear, I can get some really great changes out of playing around with those macros on my MIDI controller and really perform what's going on here. And if I want to go back to what we had before that, so I haven't messed this up, I can click on this little play button in the snapshot of the original and I'm reset back to there, which is amazing, right? So think that like this can be effects as well as the instrument that we can map into this sort of global rack over here. This is the, you know, bigger rack. Now let's say that we've kind of said, okay, let's have it so that those 8 macros do whatever we wish for it to do. And now we can create, you know, different snapshots here of combinations that we come up with that we really might like. So I was making that combination before I reset it by hand with the macros. Now let's try another thing. Let's bring this random button into play at the top here of our main instrument rack. Right, and if you like that one, it's as simple as new, and now we've got a variation, knowing that we can go back and nothing's lost. So hopefully you can kind of see where I'm going with this. So let's try again. So we could jump to this. Let's go back to the original. Let's do another. That one also could probably work with. So we've got another variation. And if we don't want any of these anymore, we could just right click on it and delete it. But we've safeguarded our original, right? And I think this is a really fun way to come up with, like, you're in quite a lot of control here because you're mapping, as I said, what you want into that main rack and the macros. And again, we can get more technical if we wish. We could add more macros, more slots. We can also map in something from the raw into here. So there's more development we can do. The reason I've kept it to 8, chosen the ones I've chosen, is, as I said, I also wanted it so that it corresponded nicely to my controller. Now, you just might have noticed that I'm moving the raw, and that's because my blue hand's moved. So again, I need to move my blue hand back over, which I can also do, and I want it back over there, so it's controlling these macros here, right? So I've now got this interactive with the MIDI controller, and I've also safeguarded the original, and I can also use that random button, right? So let's take this another step. Let's go through now track to track. So let's go to the kick drum, and let's do this workflow across our 8 tracks and sort of put them all into their own little rack. And I'll try and pick parameters here that I'm going to map that you can also like kind of take inspiration from as something that will work, as far as, you know, you could randomly just, you know, pick whatever you want. But in this case, I'm going to try and help you a little bit and sort of show you some things that, you know, make sense. But as I said, be my guest. You can pull up, you know, random stuff and go your hardest on mapping whatever you wish and just see what happens, because that's creativity, right? And Ableton Live lets us kind of go down those rabbit holes and maybe come up with something we never thought of. So again, I've put my little kick that was inside a simpler now into a global rack. I've opened up the macro tab. I can go straight to here, so I can see my snapshots. And again, I'm going to choose in my simpler things that I want to have control of, right? So I'd like the decay and sustain would be quite nice. So I'm going to put the decay on macro 1, sustain on macro 2. On this front panel here, could be nice to change the filter type. So we could actually map that, so that will actually mean that it will flick through the different filters. That's actually rather cool, something I hadn't thought of before. And when it is on a different circuit type, you can see that we then also have the drive knob. And so that's actually what I wanted to see. So I'm going to map that to macro 4. So we've got a little bit of the different filters possible and the drive that comes with some of those different filters. And then maybe on the second page, is there anything else we want? Do we really want the release or anything? I think that's good enough for the kick drum for now. So straight away, before I do anything else, I'm going to say new, and there it is. I've not made any destructive change, right? And I can click on that, and again, name it. I quite like calling it the original instead of variation 1. And I know now that I can always go back and I won't lose what I had, but I can now go other places as well. So if we're just listening to the kick, we can now again randomize. That's actually a pretty interesting kick sort of setup right there. So we could say new, random again. So again, another quite interesting idea, right? And if you want, you can go straight back to the original. And then you can tweak these, right? And the same thing with my MIDI controller. I can bring my focus into track 1 here, and I can have these variations. So we're down here on variation 2, and I can now go straight to my MIDI controller. Let's check where the blue hand is. It's in the right place. And I can now tweak this a bit. Because maybe I like it, but I want to customize it slightly. And then I could save that as a variation, right? So we've got really nice combination of, like, we're creating this environment that's kind of fun, I think, for delivering interesting ideas. So again, we can reset that back to the original if we like. Let's move on to the tom. So we'll bring that in focus. You guessed it, we're going to do the same thing. Let's put that into a rack. Let's open up the macro tab, and let's say we do a bit of, again, mapping here. So similarly, going to make a few different changes. So I'm going to have the decay. It's quite an important thing on a drum sound. Also going to map the sustain. And we could kind of do what I just did with the filter, but let's maybe look for something else. We're going to go to the second page, and we're going to have, in this case, transposition, so we can pitch our tom drum up and down. That could be really nice. We could also have a bit of random panning. That could be nice. So let's have that to macro 4. And as you can see, we've got 8 macros, so we can keep going. And maybe we put an effect behind it. So as an example, we could go in here and we could choose something that we like. Let me maybe give you an example of something. What might we try here? Yeah, let's say we had something like the phase flanger as an example, and we just mapped the dry wet of that for now into this mix. So we put that on macro 5, right? And we could bring that in. And again, if we're not sure about it in the randomization side of things, we can right click on it and exclude it from the randomization, right? So you can decide here, exclude macro from randomization, exclude it from variations. So you've got some choice there. So I'm going to say leave that out of the randomization, or I can go back in and put it back in play, right? Which is rather cool. So let's open this up. Sorry, went the wrong way there. Added more macros. We don't need that. We want snapshots. We're going to say new, and we're going to name that original. Great. So now we've got our tom drum. And now again, we can play around on the MIDI controller. Let's make sure the blue hand isn't in the right place, which it isn't. It's over on the phase flanger. Sorry, I couldn't say that. So I'm going to get my blue hand moving over till it's in the right place. Now it is. And I can go up on my, hopefully you can see from my hands here, I'm going to pop up and I'm going to bring in the B delay send here. Sorry, on the wrong track. There we go. So I've got this nice interactive action. Maybe we'll just take out a couple of the other tracks here. So I'm straight away like jamming away with my tom drum, right? And if I like that setup here, again, I don't have to randomize it. I'm kind of randomizing on the MIDI controller, right? Moving all my macros around. I'm going to hit new and there we go. So that's now guarded and I can go back to the original. And now I can change. So my thoughts behind that is, like I said, you know, if we're looking to take this loop that I created last week in the stream and evolve it into a song structure and have some variations to it as time evolves, all of this is giving me lots and lots of material and ideas. And as I said the other day when I was messing around with this, and particularly with the acid synth, I came up with the randomization of the macros that I preferred to what I had in the stream. And so, you know, that led me to the idea to make this video and sort of show you what I'm kind of doing down here and the idea behind it and how we can kind of like take our session view idea here and get more stuck into it than just sort of like perhaps some of the ways we always tend to work, right? So let's carry on here. And also with the send and returns, let's maybe look at that while we're sort of working our way along here, because we're going to go through all the tracks. So on my Novation Launch Control XL here, I've got these, as I said, A and B returns along the top, and then I've got this row of macros at the bottom that can be either the blue hand going through the devices and 8 macros to move around the devices, either Ableton deciding what it moves or you doing what we're doing here, and that is mapping it to macros that we're saying these are the 8 things that those macros do. So hopefully you followed along with that and you've got that. The other thing we can do is add more sends. So we could come over here. We've got our default project A, send A with a the return reverb return, and we've got the B delay return. Let's add another return track. So we can right click on that, insert a new return track. So we've now got a C, and let's do something quite funky there. Let's kind of have something we don't have in the project at all. Let's say maybe we do something like a spectral resonator on there, kind of something maybe that perhaps you do use or don't use, and we can set that. Make sure down the bottom here, as it's a return track, that it is 100% dry wet. That's fairly important here, so that when we're moving our macro, we're getting exactly the difference between the dry and wet. If you set this at a funny, awkward position, we actually are moving that macro and we're not really going from 0 to 100. So if it's like that, when we move the C, we're actually going from 0 to 100. So we know we're getting the corresponding value. Let's maybe set the spectrum to chorus. Could also maybe have it in pitch. Might play around with that in a little bit and send it something. So let's say we come across to track 4. Let's have some music again. Let's bring in the acid synth. And let's say now that I've got on track 4 my macros of the delay and the reverb at the moment as they were default. What I want to do is turn A, that's currently on the reverb, I'd like it to move C. And we can kind of do that up here by moving, there's 2 little up and down arrow buttons a little bit higher up, and we can use that to move down, and now you can see I'm taking over the C. So I'm getting that nice kind of wobbly sound there. Let's maybe play around with the frequency pitch here a bit. Nice, right? So I've now got this spectrum analyzer that I can dial in a bit of that as well while I'm jamming around with everything else. So let's maybe say on this acid synth, we have a bit of that. I want to go back up and add a bit of reverb, so I can do that also. Just want to change the assignment of that knob. And then on my B send, and let's go to the device, and now we can really get stuck in down here with our macros. And if you come across anything that you really like about what you're doing down here in the instrument, all the effects, if they were mapped in there, then you just save it as a variation. And you can also click in here, and we could say, you know, for a bit of fun, you know, it's up to you to decide whether that's the case or not, but it could be called the best, you know. But we can always go back. There's the original. Apart from the macros of the sends, that's the original pattern I had before I started today. And now we've got I do like the best, actually. It's definitely working for me at the moment. Let's maybe just bring the reverb down a little bit. All right. I feel a bit bad that maybe I'm having the most fun here, but I hope you're having fun watching it and it's giving you some inspiration and ideas. By the way, if you are here with me in the live stream, if you can say hello, let me know. I do hope that everything's working fine, that you can see what I'm doing with the controller, and you can also hear my voice fine and the music level fine. I just noticed that when I've got the browser open, the camera's not sort of sitting here, so apologies for that. It seems that I was probably working with it a little bit over the top of stuff, but hopefully that's now back in its place a bit better. All right, so let's carry on. We've done the tom, we've created this kind of fun little rack for it. We've preserved the original as we've been doing with the workflow. So we've got the kick rack with the original preserved. We've got some variations. The tom, we've done the same. Let's look at the bass. I mean, Meld, what a fantastic device to kind of basically get again into the macros and map some things so that you can kind of use them on the MIDI controller. So again, you could be very random with what you put on these 8 macros, what you choose to map to them. You could also be working with a MIDI controller that has more than 8 macros like me. And if you're not with a MIDI controller, you can go and set up a maximum of 16 macros can all be mapped here. And then you can still do the snapshots and randomize all these parameters in the box in Ableton, right? So there's a couple of things I'm doing because of what I'm working with, but if you're just going to stay in the software, you can do all of this mapping, and you can actually do more mapping and more randomization if you want. I'm kind of keeping it to 8 because I've got 8 macros here. By the way, hello to Lauren Bouchard in the chat there. Great that you will check this out in the replay. I did drop you a comment there just to say that, well, although I'm not focusing in on the generate and transform tools of 12 today, I'm sure there'll be a revisit of those very soon. So I'm going to bring this back to 8 macros. And I'm going to look at the Meld, and I'm going to open up my instrument rack, and I'm going to open up the snapshots, as it's called, the little camera icon, so we can save up a default of what we've got here. So also we can check things out if we like, so we could have the Meld playing. And if you're not really sure of what you need to map, you can have a bit of a play around with the basically you know, something here down here, and then decide, like, is that the thing you want to move? So you know, you can play around and have a listen to essentially those things before you map them. I'm going to go ahead and say I want the spacing on macro 1 of oscillator A. What about on oscillator B? Potentially the tone here. Yeah, that would be really nice. What about the shape? Also, so I'm not sure about the motion on this one. Could be interesting, but I think I'm going to go with shape and tone from oscillator B. Back on oscillator A, is there anything else we want? Sustain could be quite nice. So what I might actually do, I might undo those 2 mappings there, and I'll keep oscillator A along my top macros, just so I can maybe follow what I'm doing a bit easier. Let's say we have sustain on the amp envelope and the decay, both of those, and then we might have something else. Definitely could perhaps have the filter frequency, I think would be nice. And then we're going to go down and put oscillator B down at the bottom here. And sometimes it's nice to kind of break away from something that you're doing, that, you know, you might map something you don't really understand what it does, and learn by doing that, right? I kind of have a plan with what I'm mapping here, and hopefully at the very least you can follow what I'm doing and use that as a starting point. So I might take something, for example, like, could be really interesting here to get something like a modulation happening. So let's say we might make it, let's go and have a look in the matrix and see what we've got, if we've got anything already kind of going on in the modulation side of things. Yeah, we've got modulation envelope on the filter frequency. So let's say that we'd like to map modulate envelope amount to macro 8 if we can. So let's have a look at that. Just trying to think, can we take that? And no, I don't think we can map that. All right, so if we took the LFO amount instead, just bear with me because I'm just kind of thinking through here what would be a nice thing to kind of potentially add into there that could add some really quite a lot of interest that we don't currently have here. So maybe if I changed that for a moment from filter frequency of mod envelope to, I understand now, it's already mapped, right? So let me just check that. Right, it's currently already mapped, so that's what's causing that. All right, well, I'll have a think about that because I was getting a bit blocked with what I was thinking to do, but it's currently already part of what's happening over here, so I'm not really getting access to it because I've already kind of mapped things over here. So there might be a way that I can undo that, but for now anyway, there's more than enough kind of action that's going to come from that. We could also potentially, this could be really crazy. Let's try this. Yeah, that'll work. Right, so I'm going to, so there you go. Just sort of thinking about I was looking for something quite special in here that could be really, really interesting. So what I'm going to do is take the actual oscillator type of the meld in oscillator A, and I'm going to map that to a macro that can be randomized. So that's going to be really interesting. All right, so let's say new, this is our original. We can safeguard that, so we're going to get this constant meld sound, and now we could oh, that's really nice. New variation 1. I really like that. So there's a new bass line, just like that. And again, if it's a good starting point like that, that the randomization is done, and now that I've set this workflow up and I've got my MIDI controller in front of me, I can go in here and play around with the controls and maybe tweak this slightly. Really nice. Having the oscillator of A is really amazing to have that on a macro, because right, you can go through here again, another really nice bass line. So all I have to do is click new, and there it is. That was the original. Really enjoying that. If we go to the acid synth, okay, so let's work our way along. We've done the acid synth. We kind of did that first to see what that was like. Let's bring in the shaker. Just adjusting the sends a little bit on the acid synth. Right, back over to the shaker. Let's pop that in a rack. So group it. You can choose it from the menu there if you like, or Command G will get you there quicker. We're going to open up the macros here, and again with this shaker, I'm going to, generally with drum sounds, I'm going to take the amp envelope such as attack, decay, sustain and release, so I can really bring that shape in and out of those drum sounds and make them plucky or sort of open and closed drum sounds. So that's going to sound really interesting if we're performing and kind of trying to come up with other variations. So let's say straight away decay, yes, sustain, yes, mapping those over, just right clicking on with the values that I want, mapping them over there onto the macros of the global rack. Now we're going to open up our snapshot window. We're going to go into the second page, and I'm going to choose a couple of other little interesting things in here. So we might have in the LFO panel of the simpler, we might have the pitch here to a macro. And what we're going to do is we're going to change the oscillator of the LFO in the simpler from the sine to random waveform, and we'll slow it down a little bit. We'll have a listen to this in a moment. And that means we can kind of repitch these shakers a little bit over time with this random wave shape, and we can bring up the amount of that and bring it up and down. So that should be interesting. And then maybe we'll take something, actually I think it's the first time I've done it, from an effect this time. Well, actually I had the phaser I think somewhere. So the erosion I'd like to bring into this mix as well. So I'm going to say, let's have the frequency of the erosion. And what I'm going to do is bring it into the rack, and that's going to allow me to do that. So just to point out, it wasn't going to be part of that rack unless I drag it in, which is fine. It's only the shaker here, so it's part of that signal flow and the sound of the shaker, so it can actually be dragged in and put at the back of the rack. And we also might have, actually, can we map these? I think we can. So that could be really interesting. So we can actually choose the different types of the erosion, and also let's have the amount as well. So, you know, you can get really creative with this. Some of these are really fun where you can actually change, like in the meld, the oscillator, or here we can change from noise to wide noise to sine. And the other one, we change the filter type down in the filter of the simpler, which is really, really great. So if we listen to the shaker, and let's take out a couple of things. So if I go straight to my macros, let's make sure the blue hand's in the right place. It is. It's sitting on the instrument rack, which is great. So first of all, we can work with the sustain. And this could be like, you know, in the intro of your track. Then we're evolving to a bigger, more powerful shaker. We can play around with that pitch amount that I was showing you with the LFOs. So if I just change pages here manually, you'll be able to see. You can kind of hear, get that really interest about it now that's happening from this random waveform, moving the pitch very slightly on that shaker. And we can speed it up or slow it down even more. So those pitch changes sound quite rhythmical, whereas here, more chaotic. Here we can even note sync them if we want, so you can make them happen exactly every eighth note or every quarter note or something like that. But I quite like doing it in frequency and just listening to my ears to when I feel like those little pitch changes in the shaker are working quite nice and rhythmically. And listen to the difference if I take now that pitch macro off. Shaker's super static. I'll bring it up. It's a really bit of secret sauce there. It's a great way to bring some humid feel and vibe into your drum sounds, particularly things like this shaker, is to have a random LFO waveform modulating the pitch, which is what we're doing here. And we can adjust it on our macro. So let's see, I'm going to try and set up a nice alternative here. And I realized I made a mistake, so I actually want to go back a bit of a way. until I don't have any of these values changed, and I'll explain why in a moment. So if I can get right back to probably removing, I'm just Command Z my way back. So I did something that I didn't want to do there, which is one thing. It's probably a good thing that it happened to me, so you can see for yourself, and then it's something if you're doing this workflow to keep in mind and pay attention to it. So I'm almost there. I can kind of see all the macros moving little by little. I want to see eventually we're going to lose one of these things from the rack, and that should be the moment. Still going with the undos. Keep going, keep going, keep going. Was quite far that I got, unfortunately, but that happens. There we go. Right, so it's at that point, and the reason I wanted to kind of do that is because what I sadly didn't do, which is the tip here, is click new. And you want to do that to sort of safeguard what you had, right? It's because in the end, this first variation that we've created here, as I've been labeling it, is the original, right? And that way you can always go back to that. And as you can see, I've kind of been doing that across the top here. So all of those means we can return back to exactly where we were at any point. And I learned that from Electron hardware machines. So if you work with something like that, you might be familiar with that. It's an amazing live performance tool where you can go ahead and randomize everything exactly like this, but you can always get back to reloading everything and start again from zero. So it's non-destructive, which is amazing. And that's what we've got now here. So we've got the original of the shaker safeguarded, and now we can play around with our macros or use the random on the device. That's quite nice. And there we go, we've got variation. Might do a manual one. Okay, so I'm going to save that as variation 2, a manual shaker with the macros. We've got one that we randomized here, which is nice, and the original, right? So great workflow, I think. Then we can also head up to our tracks, bring in our delays. Spectrum analyzer is really nice for something different. Perhaps if you're not familiar with that effect, it can be really, really interesting for what it's bringing to the table there. All right, let's have our open hi-hat and work on that. Let's have a bit of a volume balance as well. just pop a limiter on the master track, just so that for those of you in the stream, the music isn't too quiet as we're working on it unmixed. So let's just give ourselves a little bit of a boost up there. Okay, let's get into this open hi-hat, make it into a rack, Command G, Control G if you're on a Windows system. Similar to the shaker, love with drum sounds, having control over the decay. That's going to allow me to really tighten up the sound. Same with the sustain, can open and close the sound. Sometimes the attack, if you want to sort of round off your sounds and make them a bit more analog, and also with the release, perhaps the open hi-hat, the release could be interesting, but that's just going to extend how much of the tail of that is going to play through. I could also, again, probably use my same trick with the LFO in the middle here. Let's have a random wave, noise waveform. Let's add it to the pitch. Let's have the pitch sort of around the same frequency pitch, and then the amount of that pitch is what I'm going to modulate with that LFO. So I'm going to map that to macro 4. And let's also maybe have something with the filter. Let's have the frequency knob as well. And yeah, let's have a listen to that, see how we go. Okay, I started to do the same thing as a moment ago, so let's just stop for a quick second there and undo that. Right, just to get back to where we were. Okay, so that when the last macro disappeared, which was the filter frequency, right? So that's, as I said, I've done it twice. I guess my brain's working a bit harder, perhaps in this live stream. Don't forget, if you're following my system here, to go new and then save this as the original, right, is the idea behind this. That way we can always go back to that version any point. It's our starting point, right? And then we can work from that into lovely, weird and wonderful places. So let's go. Now we can crack on, make a new open hi-hat. A little bit less on the pitch LFO on the open hi-hat, as it doesn't sound quite as nice as the shaker. Okay, let's save that variation. Let's also maybe add in here some random panning. So map that to macro 6. And let's now try rolling the dice with Ableton. Let's do some randoming. Yeah, so the main one that's not kind of working there, which kind of comes through pretty quickly there, is the filter frequency. So we might just right click on that and say exclude macro from randomization. Now we could try again. That, for example, is really interesting with the panning like that, so we could have that as a new variation. That's also nice. So you can see how quickly we can come up with things here, so we can always go back to our original. It's a very subtle change, more dramatic. Okay, let's bring in the brakes. So look at the breaks track. I don't think I've got a lot on there at this point in time as far as the instrument, as this was an audio break loop. So we might have some effects perhaps on the track that we could bring into this workflow, but we've obviously got our send and returns as well, and this could sound quite nice actually with a bit of resonator on the C return. Let's see if I can move myself to the C. There we go. Yeah, so that resonator kind of adds interesting little bit of character to this, the A macro, C macro should I say. And then Sprick in the Vox. Play around with the send and returns. So essentially we've now got a loop that we started with today, and we've now got this loop that we can really interact with and come up with variations of our own, working with the MIDI controller and adjusting the macros, send and returns, and this row of device macros, in this case of the Novation launch control. But yeah, I really wanted to, like, the reason I ended up sort of wanting to share that with you is a lot of people tend to struggle with coming up with ways to sort of evolve perhaps the instrument and then the MIDI that you have. So like when we began, we had this synthesizer here and we had this sequence that we made last week in last week's stream, but I did copy a second clip of the sequence down that's different to the first, and we can use that as a variation. But now we've sort of like looked at it from an instrument point of view, as well as the send and returns, and we're getting physical with it, tactile, and we're getting kind of like we're performing our track. So what we could do now, there's a few options here, but the view would be to, as I said, like come up with perhaps some different parts of this track and jam around with it, this loop. But what we could do, for example, is things like we could set up to record some of those variations that we've created away from the original. So we know we've safeguarded the original loop. If everything here is set to original, let's just check that we go back to how the track sounded so we can work our way along. And we could also, with another MIDI controller here, map that so that we could be clicking, you know, all of those little sections within the devices. So those last two I haven't set up in any racks. And so now if we hit play on scene 1, 100% it was how it was sounding at the start of today. I also do have this little scene 2 here, which literally is some planning where I've made a little bit of difference on the breaks already. What it is the loop is pitched slightly different within the audio clip, and also the preserve envelope's a little bit of a different value. In the open hi-hat, I've got a completely new pattern, which is great. Acid synth, as I said, we've got 2 different patterns possible, and the bass, something similar. We've got the bass that plays just on a single note, and then I've got a bass MIDI clip where it evolves into a new bass line with new pitch. But a lot of these variations that we've now created today, let's say we start with the acid synth one, let's say the best one, when I click that, that changes the instrument, but of course it's not sort of printed anywhere, right? And it's not going to print a new MIDI clip in this case with new pitches. It's all about the adjustment of the instrument. So I hope that makes sense. So perhaps the best option here is, if we would want to work with that as our starting point, would be to go and set up an audio track that then listens to this synthesizer. Okay, so we're going to set it to in audio from the acid synth track. We're going to hit the record. So we're going to record arm it down the bottom here, and now we can hit record and we can grab what happens in that track. And again, we could move through the different variations and record them kind of like what I'm doing here. So let's say we do this for a moment. Don't worry about the waveform being quite low. We can obviously turn that up in a moment. It's not a problem. Let's capture a few bars of that. Okay, that's enough, and then we can kind of, you know, bring up our waveform and we could boost it a bit. If it was quite low, so maybe what I would do in that case is sort of come back over to the synth, and just for the moment I would bring that volume up. Wrong track there, so I'll just put that back down. That was the bass, so we'll bring that up to sort of 0, see where we're hitting now. So we'll just redo that. So it was quite low, it would be boosted but not really enough. So let's try that again. Can always make things louder. I mean, that's one of the easier things to do. Again, let's capture a bit of it. Better, because we could almost clip it now, which we don't want to do. So we can crank the volume up there within the clip envelope over here on the left. So what we've done now is we've got, you know, this clip in audio of the MIDI clip 2 with that variation of the instrument itself. So we could label that up as such, so we could get in there and make sure that we know that it's you know, scene 2 and whatever label we want to give it. So it's that MIDI clip that's matching. Let's just say give it the number 2. We don't really need to say scene 2. And we could also say that it's, in this case, it was the best, right? So let's come back and say the best. And then it's MIDI clip 2, right? Because the reason I'm saying that is that if we put that down a little bit, we could also go ahead now and stay with the best, but we could do a copy of MIDI clip 1 in the best, right? So we could also record that. So let's go ahead and do that. depending on how much variation there is in the clip, is depending on how long you might record your take here. You might want a long take with lots happening, or you might just want a really nice 4-bar loop. It's up to you. Again, we'll just boost that up a bit. So we've now got a couple of copies of that in audio, and we can label that up. So that would be the best, and then 1. And the thing is, now you could use those triggered within your scenes as variations of that synth, right? And we wouldn't be using the MIDI anymore. We might even switch the instrument off. It really is giving you another choice, right, of how you could kind of print those variations into a physical clip that we can then work with. So just this was an example of what we could do with those variations. But if we do that, we're sort of walking away a bit from also the live and interactive jam that we could do when we could perform this track, right, into from a loop into an arrangement, which is where I want to head with, I would say, the next video I'm going to do in this kind of series. So let me bring these down a little bit. And let's say we just turn that track from an input back to a regular audio track. Doesn't need to be receiving any more input. And now if we just solo that for a second, we've got, bring the volume down a little bit. Got this lovely audio. And as I said, if you want, you know, as I said, it could be all of this, which is what, more than 16 bars. It would be 16 bars looped here. So you might just decide that you just want these 8 bars looped, etc. And then we've got a second version of it, our own audio clip here. Similarly, we can choose our favorite part, right? In this case, we might have the whole 16 bars. And in that case, as I said, we've printed that, and we might just be playing through our live set and just trigger those clips. And we're not really, you know, live performing or getting involved in it, but we've printed what we had going on in here and this best variation, right? If we don't do that, well, we have the option then to come back and, as I said, like really live perform what we're going to do. So it might be like one big live jam that we do, or we might just do one big live jam of the acid synth track and then go back and pick our favorite part of it and do that with multiple instruments at the same time or one at a time. So let's maybe look at that then as an approach. So let's say we've done this approach. Where we've printed some of those variations and turned them into an audio clip that we can trigger at any point. We could add effects to that. We can use our send and returns on that audio track, but we've kind of gone ahead, printed the instrument, printed the variation, printed the track, so to speak, and what's going on here. So let's say we do it a different way. Let's say that we set ourselves up here on the acid synth and we just solo that track for a second, and we go ahead and we do this, like, as I said, I'm not sure if you've heard of multi-tracking instruments before, but, you know, we have the whole track playing over into the arrangement and we work on all the different tracks at the same time, and we might do a really long take and then go back and pick our favorite parts from that. Or we might set this up a little bit like this, where we kind of, let's just do one of these. Let's reset our playhead to 1.1. Let's pop into the arrangement view. There shouldn't be anything in here, but I'm just going to double check. We're not going to be overwriting anything. There's no loop turned on. That's great. So let's say we hit the global record this time, so that we're sending what we're going to be doing into the arrangement view. Hit our global record. Hit the acid synth. And now we can just get jamming, essentially, and we can go into the instrument itself and we can play with the MIDI controller and record all of our movements and things. Now let's make sure the blue hand's where we want it to be, which it is. And I'm going to go back to the original in the variations here. Maybe like we'll give ourselves a little bit of other things for context. Just so we get a feel for what we're doing as well. Over to the send and returns. Obviously the 3, there's a little bit more movement on the controller to change between the different sends, but again, you know, you might have a MIDI controller that gives you different options to that. So we could carry on doing that for as long as we like, and we're just working on the acid synth at this moment in time. And then we can hit stop. Obviously it was recording whatever else, by the way, was playing in the background there. Even though we weren't hearing those tracks were not muted, they were launched. So we do have a bit, when we're looking here in the arrangement view, we do have other things showing as far as the kick and the bass and all those kind of things go. Now, again, I kind of made a couple of mistakes today. Happens in a live stream. What was just happening there hasn't translated in here, and maybe you would already be aware of why. And it's because, again, similarly to what I just did a moment ago, we really want to be printing that into audio. And so all I've achieved in here, unfortunately, which I'm going to obviously redo it, is I've just printed the MIDI of that synth pattern 1, which is not really that useful to us because we already have that in multiple locations. So I'm going to clear this all away. And next time as well, again, you know, as I said, we can kind of like, you know, take out those other tracks. It's nice to have the context, doesn't really matter. We can obviously remove the MIDI like I've just done, but perhaps we'll just have, as I said, just the kick and maybe the bass so we can hear that. And again, as I said, we can clear those things out in a moment when we come back to what we've got in the arrangement view. So what I do need to do is, again, create another audio track alongside my acid synth track. I want to set it to listen to the acid synth track that's important. I want to set it to in, and I want to set it to record, because everything I was just doing a moment ago, we actually want to be going into that audio track, a nice long take, and then we can go through it and pick out maybe, again, sections of it. Maybe we have 32 bars of it evolving. That's really up to you. I'm not your, I'm hopefully giving you lots of inspiration, but, you know, obviously you can pick this up and then run with it and, you know, find your best way to work with it, let's say. So let's reset everything, get ourselves in the frame here. So on our acid synths, let's go back to the original. So I'm resetting all my macros down there. Send and returns are okay. Again, we can disable those, but I'll start with what I've got there, and we're going to hit the global record, hit play here. And let's have our kick. Bass, just for context, they are going to be printing over here, as you can see, but that's okay. They're going to be not what we're concerned about. We're more concerned about this track that's coming in here now that we didn't have a moment ago, because I didn't get that quite right. So now I'm on track 4, and I'm going to do what I was doing a moment ago, and that is play around with my macros, see what we come up with. And just make sure, again, like that you're on the right track, blue hand in the right place. And if you wanted to be doing the bass line at the same time, then you just have an audio track running at the same time and you move from instrument to instrument. But perhaps it's easier to do them one at a time. Again, that's kind of All right, I'm going to hit stop there. But that's a lot of fun, and I'm kind of really engaging with that MIDI that I created last week and the instrument that I created last week, and I'm bringing this MIDI controller in and having fun and coming up with, ideas and creativity here that I wouldn't if I didn't go about sort of setting up this kind of workflow. And as I said, if you are with working without this kind of MIDI controller, you can put your instruments into a rack like I've shown you, map the macros, and then use these snapshots as a way to kind of come up with new and interesting variations and then record them out or make them your main synth track as you wish. That's up to you. But what we've got now over here in the arrangement view is this nice long take of the synth, just like you do in a typical studio workflow where you track the instruments, play your guitar, play the drums, and record them for as long as you like. And then, as I said, we could go through and maybe all of this first 16 bars will be the first 16 bars of the track. Perhaps it's something that keeps on repeating, or perhaps we jump to some other part of the take. So we could chop this up now into parts. That would be an idea, or it could just be one long take that continuously plays through with everything that evolved like it did, or we find favorite sections of it and we loop those sections up, or we say this is going to be in the intro, this is in the outro. So it opens up a lot of doors and possibilities. So if we quickly listen to that, for example, here we've got, we need to do a quick step there, and that is return this track from an input to a regular audio track. Now we're in business. Or maybe we prefer this. And perhaps this section becomes the start of that synth, and we move to that later in the track. So this is giving me lots of ideas. That's the kind of reason for setting up this workflow in Ableton Live. And things like that. Could be a really nice transitional piece that again you cut out of the audio here and place that somewhere on another track or on this same track, and you have that positioned exactly where you want. So again, it's also giving you a bit of a look at what are some of the advantages of working in audio sometimes as opposed to keeping everything in MIDI. There are many advantages, and these are sort of things that as a producer, it's a bit of our job to weigh up those discussions sometimes and think, what would this be like if I was working in audio? What would this be like if I was working in MIDI? So I'm going to pretty much wrap up today's stream around that point. Hopefully this has given you, as I said, some inspiration to fire up Ableton Live. If you've got a MIDI controller or MIDI controllers sitting around and you've not sort of played with them in this way or mapped them or thought, hey, I'm working in the box, but I could kind of make this much more feel like a studio and a live performance. I should kind of get stuck in and do a bit of mapping. Hopefully it's given you some inspiration to think about that. I think this has, given me, it's taken that loop that was already quite nice and it's given it, a new lease of life, and it's allowed me to interact with it in a different way and come up with new parts from it that in a way that's, as I said, very organic and a performance way. So as always, if you're enjoying the content on this channel, do hit the bell icon, subscribe to the channel. Obviously, I appreciate the support, trying to build a nice community here and share with you pretty much all the knowledge over about 20 or 30 years of, producing electronic music and working in Ableton Live and teaching others. So, give the videos a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Share it with your mates. Drop us a comment. If you want to see something else in another video, let me know what you found beneficial from this video, and I will look forward to catching you in the next live stream next weekend, next Sunday. Let's do it all again. And just to let you know, with this project, I do plan to, I'll just lay it out a little bit more so I'm organized, and then I will put this from the loop with these techniques into the arrangement view, and then we'll start working on the arrangement. Just today I'm going to leave it at this point because it was also overlapping something I was uncovering as I started to think that I was just going to do that. And I thought, well, hang on, I might as well show you this so it gives you lots of new ideas. And then next week's live stream, I can just kind of get stuck into taking this loop over into the arrangement view and then starting arranging it, but not copy paste. This kind of workflow, playing, interacting, recording it over into there, and then working on the arrangement that way around. So you can see another way to arrange a track. So thanks again for joining me. Have a great rest of your Sunday. Take care. Happy music making, and ciao for now. Bye.